Welcome back to the Paranormal State, Washington, and UFO UAP. With Makāula Nakae, a lifelong experiencer and ET contactee since 1990. Today's episode, 1964, Lonnie Zamora Incident. Benchmark of CE2 documentation. The genesis of the Socorro incident. A routine patrol interrupted. To truly understand why the Lonnie Zamora encounter remains the gold standard of close encounters of the second kind, CE2, we have to examine the exact sequence of events on that late afternoon of April 24, 1964. The brilliance of the Socorro case lies not just in the bizarre object that touched down in the New Mexico desert, but in the unimpeachable credibility of the man who found it and the ordinary, mundane nature of the minutes leading up to the impossible. It was approximately 5:45 p.m. on a Friday in Socorro, a modest mining and ranching community tucked along the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico. The weather was clear, dry, and calm. Socorro's history stretches back centuries. Originally home to Piro Pueblo Indian villages who famously provided food to Spanish conquistador Juan de Oñate in 1598, earning the town the name Socorro, meaning help or succor, the area grew into a quiet, tight-knit agricultural settlement irrigated by the Rio Grande. By the mid-20th century, it was a slow-paced, traditional New Mexico town where everybody knew their neighbors and local life revolved around the rhythm of the seasons, livestock, and local trade. While Socorro settled into a quiet rural identity by the mid-1900s, its surrounding mountains, like Socorro Peak and the nearby Magdalena Mountains, carried the skeleton of a wilder past. In the late 1800s, the region experienced a massive silver, lead, and zinc mining boom. Prospectors flooded the area, railroads were laid, and boom towns like Kelly sprang up overnight. By 1964, most of those mines were played out or abandoned, leaving behind a landscape peppered with old prospector pits, dirt tracks, winding arroyos, and abandoned shafts tucked away in the arid foothills just outside town, the exact kind of lonely, desolate terrain where Lonnie Zamora stumbled upon an unknown object. Despite its sleepy, rural appearance, Socorro County was quietly caught between historical isolation and high-tech modernity by the 1960s. Just a couple of decades earlier, a short drive south of Socorro brought the world into the atomic age with the detonation of the first nuclear bomb at the Trinity site. Furthermore, the region was flanked by vast military testing ranges like White Sands. When Lonnie Zamora chased a speeding vehicle off the highway and down into a dusty gravel pit near an old dynamite shack on the edge of town, he wasn't just in an empty desert, he was right at the intersection of a quiet, old-school ranching town and the secretive, high-stakes military-scientific complex of the American Southwest. Patrolman Lonnie Zamora, a respected veteran officer with the Socorro Police Department known throughout the county for his sober demeanor, reliability, and steady nerves, was parked in his standard squad car on the southern edge of town near a courthouse. He was actively engaged in routine duty, tracking local traffic and looking for speeders on a stretch of highway heading out toward Magdalena. The tranquility of the patrol was shattered instantly by an anomaly that demanded immediate action. Zamora heard a sharp, thunderous roar. It was not the familiar, high-pitched whine of a passing military jet or the steady hum of a commercial prop plane. Instead, it was described as a distinct rumbling blast, a sound that caught his attention so sharply that he momentarily abandoned his speeder pursuit. Looking off toward the southwestern edge of town, toward a rugged, elevated plateau dotted with gravelly arroyos, Zamora saw a brilliant bluish-orange flame. Living in an area with nearby mining operations and ammunition storage, Zamora's immediate assumption was entirely terrestrial. He believed a local dynamite storage shack had blown up, or a civilian vehicle had careened off a ridge and crashed into a ravine. There was no thought of UFOs, little green men, or impossible physics, just a public safety emergency requiring a law enforcement response. Acting purely out of professional duty, Zamora dropped his ongoing traffic stop, keyed his radio microphone to alert police dispatcher Nep Lopez that he was breaking away to investigate a suspected car wreck or explosion, and threw his cruiser into gear. He sped away from the main road, navigating a rough, winding dirt track that led up onto the gravel mesa. The terrain was rugged, featuring steep ridges and dry washes that obscured visibility from the main highway. Zamora drove his patrol car up a steep, narrow gravel ridge overlooking a deep arroyo. He parked his vehicle, prepared to step out and render aid to what he assumed were injured motorists or blast victims. Instead, when he crested that ridge, he did not find a smoking car wreck. He found an egg-shaped metallic craft resting silently on 4 landing legs, with 2 figures standing beside it, thrusting his ordinary police patrol straight into the bleeding edge of high strangeness. When Officer Lonnie Zamora crested the steep gravel ridge overlooking the secluded arroyo in Socorro, New Mexico, the mundane reality of his routine patrol dissolved instantly. What he witnessed over the next few minutes transformed a suspected car crash into the most thoroughly verified close encounter of the second kind in modern history, while brushing right up against the threshold of a third kind encounter. As Zamora parked his cruiser and stepped out to investigate, he was met with a breathtaking visual: an object resting quietly on the desert floor, roughly 150 to 200 yards away. The craft was egg-shaped or oval, glistening with a brilliant white finish reminiscent of polished aluminum or smooth fiberglass. It stood on 4 short, angled landing legs deployed in a V-shaped pattern, lifting the bottom hull several feet off the ground. Estimated at roughly 15 to 20 feet long, it lacked any visible windows, doors, wings, propellers, jet intakes, or seams that would indicate conventional aerospace engineering. Painted or stamped directly onto the side of the metallic hull was a striking, precise geometric marking: a vertical red line, or arrow pointing upward, rising from a horizontal baseline, with a small half-circle perched directly on top, resembling an inverted U intersecting a crossbar and arrow. This insignia played a massive role in validating Zamora's account, as a lone police officer under high-stress conditions rarely invents specific complex geometric symbols out of thin air. Just as Zamora began processing the bizarre geometry of the craft, his attention was drawn to 2 figures standing nearby on the desert floor. The figures were short, roughly the height of children or small adults, and were entirely encased in tight-fitting, gleaming white coveralls or jumpsuits. As Zamora's police cruiser crested the ridge, the figures appeared startled. One of them turned abruptly, looking directly toward the officer's vehicle, with a motion that suggested surprise or alarm, before quickly ducking out of sight behind the hull of the craft. This specific moment creates a fascinating taxonomic debate among ufologists, because Zamora clearly observed living, non-human, or anomalous entities directly associated with a structured craft. The sighting technically hits the criteria for a close encounter of the third kind, CE3. However, the encounter is universally cataloged as the gold standard of a CE2 physical trace because the entities vanished immediately behind the hull, leaving the scorched desert and landing pad impressions as the enduring physical legacy. Fearing the strange apparatus was going to blow up, Zamora bolted away from his cruiser to take cover. As he fled, the object emitted another deafening roar, accompanied by a glowing blue and orange flame beneath its base. Without a sound other than the roar, the craft rose vertically to about 20 feet, hovered briefly, and then accelerated away horizontally at low altitude, clearing a nearby 8-foot-tall dynamite shack by just a few feet before vanishing over the distant mountains. When Patrolman Lonnie Zamora watched the egg-shaped craft blast away from the Socorro arroyo, he was left standing alone in the desert with a racing pulse and an unbelievable story. But unlike 99% of UFO reports that rely entirely on subjective eyewitness testimony, the Socorro incident left behind a hard, measurable footprint. Within hours of the sighting, military intelligence officers, state police, and civilian scientific consultants swarmed the remote desert arroyo. What they documented in the soil and vegetation turned a local police report into a national scientific crisis. Investigators found 4 deep, distinct circular indentations pressed symmetrically into the hard-pan caliche soil, where the craft's V-shaped landing legs had rested. Soil mechanics analysis revealed that the impressions were pressed with immense downward force, estimated at several tons, yet there were no vehicle tire tracks leading into or out of the arroyo. The object had evidently landed vertically and lifted off vertically, showing localized magnetic alterations and thermal dehydration. The native desert scrub and greasewood roots directly inside the landing footprint were actively charred, blackened, and smoking when backup officers arrived minutes later. The scorching showed exposure to a brief, intensely directional burst of heat that had dehydrated the plants without generating the wide-area wildfires a conventional rocket blast would have caused. Despite the deafening roar and the brilliant blue and orange flame reported by Zamora, there was no unburned fuel residue, no metal fragments, no chemical exhaust byproduct, and no chemical fallout whatsoever found in the arroyo. Skeptics always look for the human flaw: hallucination, attention-seeking, mental fatigue, or outright hoaxing. In the Socorro case, that defense completely collapsed. Lonnie Zamora was universally vetted by local judges, the sheriff's department, the FBI, and military investigators as an intensely honest, sober, religious, and level-headed law enforcement officer. He did not seek media attention, gave very few interviews, and actively expressed distress over the intense public spotlight the case brought him. In 1964, a small-town New Mexico cop had nothing to gain and everything to lose by reporting a bizarre close encounter, yet his story never wavered. The case dealt a devastating blow to Project Blue Book's credibility, culminating in a rare moment of bureaucratic surrender. Major Hector Quintanilla, the head of Project Blue Book, privately and publicly admitted that the Socorro sighting was a profound headache for the Air Force, writing in official evaluations that it was the best documented, most inexplicable case in their files. There is no question that Lonnie Zamora saw an object, and the effects on the physical evidence leave no doubt that the object was real. Faced with undeniable forensic traces and a flawless witness, the Air Force officially classified the incident as unidentified. The 1964 Lonnie Zamora incident was not directly associated with radioactive exposure or an atomic bomb explosion, but it was deeply tied to the atomic and military geography of New Mexico. While some early sensationalized rumors and UFO lore occasionally whispered about radiation at the Socorro landing site, official Air Force, Project Blue Book, and civilian scientific investigations tested the soil and landing indentations for radioactivity. No abnormal radiation was ever found. Zamora himself suffered no radiation sickness, though he experienced temporary flash blindness from the bright blue and orange flame. New Mexico as a whole was the birthplace of the atomic age, home to the Trinity Site test and Los Alamos National Laboratory further north. Because Socorro County was flanked by massive secret military installations, like White Sands Missile Range, many investigators and locals naturally suspected the object was a classified government prototype or experimental device tied to the region's heavy defense infrastructure. The mention of Yakima, Washington, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, refers to a completely different historical thread: secret wartime and Cold War government transport routes and installations, rather than the Lonnie Zamora incident. Los Alamos was the secret headquarters of the Manhattan Project, where the first atomic bombs were designed and built. Yakima, specifically the Yakima Firing Center in Washington State, became a massive, isolated military reservation used heavily during World War II and the Cold War for secret maneuvers, artillery testing, and training. In alternative history and fringe research, logistical corridors, secret military transport lines, or aerial testing zones are frequently drawn between major defense installations like Los Alamos, Hanford, Washington's plutonium production site near Yakima, and White Sands, New Mexico. However, Lonnie Zamora's encounter did not happen on a transit route between Yakima and Los Alamos. It occurred entirely locally on a gravel arroyo road, just outside the small town of Socorro, New Mexico, while Zamora was on local police duty chasing a speeding car. Unlike many modern close encounter or alien abduction narratives, which frequently feature periods of unaccounted for time where witnesses lose hours of memory, the timeline of Zamora's 1964 encounter is remarkably tight, continuous, and well documented by radio logs. The entire sequence of events unfolded in real time over just a few short minutes. At approximately 5:45 p.m., Zamora was actively pursuing a speeding car when he heard the loud roar and saw the flame descend into the arroyo. He immediately radioed police dispatcher Nep Lopez to log that he was breaking off the pursuit to check out a possible vehicle accident. He drove down into the arroyo, witnessed the egg-shaped craft and the figures, fled back to his car in panic as it lifted off, and watched it depart. Moments later, when New Mexico State Police Sergeant Samuel Chavez arrived at the scene following Zamora's frantic radio call, the brush was still actively smoldering. Because every phase of the sighting was anchored by dispatch logs, radio timestamps, and the immediate arrival of backup officers, there was no gap or distortion in time. It was a fast, hyper-intense daylight encounter from start to finish. In the grand timeline of mid-century ufology, an egg-shaped or elliptical craft like the one Lonnie Zamora described in Socorro was statistically rare and distinct, standing out from the geometric norms of early UFO reporting. When examining how many egg-shaped or oval craft were recognized or reported up to 1964, a few historical patterns emerge. In the 2 decades preceding 1964, stretching back to Kenneth Arnold's 1947 sighting and the 1952 Washington, D.C. wave, public and military taxonomy was heavily dominated by 2 shapes: disc saucers, flat, circular, hubcap-like objects; cigars, torpedoes, long, cylindrical, rocket-like motherships, such as the famous 1948 Chile's Wooded Airline pilot sighting. Oval, egg-shaped, or football-like craft did exist in the Project Blue Book files, but they were usually lumped broadly into categories like elliptical, oval, or globe-shaped. They made up a minor percentage of total reports compared to classic discs. Before Zamora's 1964 encounter, Europe, particularly France and Italy, experienced waves of sightings involving egg-shaped or dome-shaped craft. During the massive 1954 French UFO wave, several witnesses described small, ovoid, or spinning, top-shaped machines landing near railway tracks or rural fields, such as the famous Marius de Wilde case in Queribel. In Italy, prominent mass sightings, like the 1954 Florence Stadium incident, occasionally featured egg-shaped or silver-domed anomalies floating over crowds. Before April 1964, when people heard about landed craft with occupants, they usually pictured classic metal saucers or cartoonish silver spaceships. Lonnie Zamora's description of a smooth, white, egg-shaped elliptical object resting on landing legs forced Project Blue Book and civilian investigators to take ovoid craft seriously. Because it was backed by physical landing traces, the 4 indentations and burned brush, and an unimpeachable police officer witness. The egg-shaped craft graduated from a rare oddity in the filing cabinets to a benchmark archetype in close encounter history. Statistical analyses of decades of UFO data show that true egg-shaped craft have historically hovered at less than 1% to 2% of all total reported UFO shapes, making Zamora's encounter not just a historic mystery, but a genuinely rare bird in the history of high strangeness. For years, the Zamora case was primarily the domain of Project Blue Book files and civilian researchers. However, its reputation skyrocketed within official channels when high-ranking military and intelligence figures began using it as a gold standard example of an unsolvable anomaly. Major Hector Quintanilla grew deeply candid about the case later in life. In official retrospectives, including an article he wrote for the CIA's Internal Journal Studies in Intelligence titled The Investigation of UFOs, Quintanilla explicitly singled out the Socorro sighting, writing that the Zamora encounter was the best documented case on record because his team could neither debunk it nor find a terrestrial source. In the immediate aftermath, Officer Zamora faced a punishing wave of media scrutiny and curiosity seekers that ultimately caused him to step away from law enforcement. Over the decades, as the initial sensationalism faded, the local community of Socorro realized they were sitting on a unique piece of modern history. In April 2012, Socorro officially commemorated the event with a dedicated roadside marker and public art installation, transforming a past source of tension into a badge of civic pride. Modern ufology treats the Zamora incident as the ultimate baseline for a credible CE2, because it bridged the gap between hard physical evidence, official military bewilderment, and an unimpeachable witness who described a stark, mechanical reality devoid of high-fructose sci-fi tropes like telepathic messages or abductions. While the social ridicule that forced Lonnie Zamora into hiding in 1964 has largely dissolved, the incident is still shadowed by a different, more sophisticated kind of stigma. Today, the case sits at a fascinating ideological crossroads, splitting researchers, historians, and skeptics into rigid camps. For mainstream skeptics, aerospace historians, and debunkers, accepting an unexplained verdict is professionally unacceptable. Because the laws of physics and the historical record of the 1960s Cold War arms race leave zero room for extraterrestrial visitors, skeptics search for an earthly anchor. The reigning secular theory suggests that Zamora inadvertently witnessed a classified, unacknowledged U.S. military test vehicle, perhaps an early experimental vertical takeoff and landing. The DOL craft, a lunar landing simulator, or a secret propulsion test, run out of nearby White Sands missile range or Holloman Air Force Base. Skeptics argue that claiming an extraterrestrial origin relies on assuming that because the Air Force couldn't identify it, it must be alien, ignoring that military investigators often preferred labeling a case unidentified rather than admitting a top-secret black-budget aerospace test had breached civilian airspace. Skeptics occasionally lean into theories suggesting a startled man in the desert could misidentify ordinary equipment, smoke, or shadows, which were then amplified by an eager media. Conversely, ufologists and independent researchers treat the Zamora incident as an almost untouchable sacred text, precisely because terrestrial explanations fall apart under rigorous scrutiny. Project Blue Book and independent investigators heavily vetted the secret military theory at the time, finding that no branch of the U.S. military or aerospace contractor ever came forward to claim a vehicle matching Zamora's description, nor could they explain how a roaring, unshielded plasma flames scorched the desert without generating a massive forest fire or structural heat signatures. Ufologists argue that lingering academic skepticism is an institutional defense mechanism against admitting anomalies exist outside orthodox paradigms. In the current era of congressional UAP transparency hearings, the nature of stigma has fundamentally changed. When military pilots testifying before Congress describe craft executing instantaneous acceleration or transmedium travel, the 1964 Socorro incident is no longer viewed as an isolated, embarrassing rural fairy tale. Instead, it is reevaluated through a modern lens as an early, pristine data point in a long-running pattern of high-performance, non-human encounters. Ultimately, the stigma surrounding Lonnie Zamora's encounter today is no longer about whether he saw something. The physical impressions in the dirt and his impeccable reputation settled that. The remaining stigma is a philosophical battleground. Whether we attribute the unknown to our own classified military ambition or to something far stranger looking back at us from the stars. I personally have a deep fascination with these egg-shaped craft, largely because of my own direct experience. In the summer of 2013, I witnessed a fully materialized gunmetal black egg-shaped craft hovering right above Seattle's iconic Space Needle, viewed from the west side hill of Capitol Hill. It was roughly 5 to 8 meters in height. It floated upward, transformed into a tiny shining orb, and silently glided across the top of a nearby condominium. What always stands out about encounters like that is the distinct pattern. At that exact moment in time, it had a habit of returning to stage a second sighting, almost as if to confirm, no, you aren't hallucinating, you're seeing this clearly. Reflecting on Lonnie Zamora's 1964 UFO encounter in Socorro alongside modern sightings, it raises a compelling question. What was the purpose of these landings and the beings stepping out beside them? Was it biological reconnaissance, botanical research into local flora, or something far beyond our current understanding of environmental cataloging? To be continued. Watch and listen. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full podcast now. Explore the archive Cosmic Awakening Volume 1, 1991, Peru, Journey into the Unknown. Sacred Valley of the Incas. Volume 2, Ascension 2012, The Golden Alchemy. Part 3, The First Contact and the Paranormal State. Join the journey. New episodes drop periodically. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute exploration into the evolution of ufology, perfect for your daily plunge into decoding hidden messages from outer space, designed to raise awareness and foster human evolution. Subscribe to support your inner development. Thumbs up to help push our channel through the algorithm. Comment below. Share your thoughts on today's episode.